Close your eyes for a second and listen to that. That's not a malfunction. That's not something going wrong. That is a perfectly healthy engine doing exactly what it was designed to do. In about 1910, on a farm somewhere in the American Midwest, this sound meant everything was going well. It meant the grain was moving. The corn was shelling. The water was pumping. But here is the thing about that belt you can see spinning between the engine and the thresher. It is moving at roughly 1,500 feet per minute. That is about 17 miles an hour. And there is nothing, no guard, no cage, no cover, between that belt and the sleeve of your shirt. Farmers called these machines their salvation. Coroners called them something else. Welcome to Farm Tech Origins, where we dig into how agricultural technology changed the world, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically, and usually both at the same time. I'm glad you're here because today's story is one I genuinely think gets overlooked. We talk a lot about tractors. We talk about combines, irrigation, the green revolution, but we almost never talk about the decades before the tractor took over. The 30 or 40 years when the American farm was mechanizing, desperately, and the machines doing the work were these enormous, dangerous, permanent iron fixtures that sat in your barn and ran everything by brute rotating force. To understand why farmers wanted them so badly, you have to understand what life on a working farm actually looked like around 1890. Horses. That was the answer to almost every power question on a 19th century farm. Need to pull a plow? Horses. Need to drive a threshing machine? Horses. Need to pump water from a well 60 feet deep? A horse walking in circles, turning a sweep. A good working farm might have 8 or 10 draft animals. The cost to feed them, shoe them, house them, and replace them when they died was enormous. And they got tired. You could not ask a horse to run a corn sheller for 6 hours straight without rest. What farmers needed was power that didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't need shoeing, and didn't kick you when you were cold and tired at 5 in the morning. The answer arrived. Clattering and smoking in the form of the stationary engine. Now, when most people picture early farm engines, they picture steam, and we will get to steam. But before we do, I want to spend some time on the engine type that was actually most common on small and mid-sized farms from roughly the 1890s through the 1920s, the internal combustion stationary engine, and specifically the type known as a hit-and-miss engine. The name hit-and-miss describes its firing pattern, and once you understand how it works, that name makes perfect sense. Most engines you know, your car, your lawnmower, fire on every revolution or close to it. They run at a set speed by controlling how much fuel goes into each combustion cycle. A hit-and-miss engine works on a completely different philosophy. Here is how it governs itself. Mounted on the crankshaft are 2 small weighted balls, called a centrifugal governor. When the engine is running at the speed it is supposed to, let's say 300 RPM, those weights spin outward and hold a small latch that keeps the exhaust valve open just slightly. The cylinder cannot build compression. The engine does not fire. The flywheel, which might weigh 200 or 300 pounds, coasts on its own momentum. It keeps spinning from its last combustion, but that flywheel slowly loses speed. When it drops below the set RPM, the governor weights fall inward. The exhaust latch releases. The engine builds compression, and on the next stroke, bang, it fires. The flywheel speeds up. The governor flies out again, and we're back to coasting hit, miss, hit, miss, 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 hit. That is the sound you heard at the top of this video. Not a malfunction. The engine is telling you it has enough power. When you put a load on it, hook it to a water pump, engage a belt drive, it fires more often because it needs to. The sound changes. It wakes up. These engines were everywhere. Garages and barn corners mounted on skids so they could be moved by horse or wagon. Farmers used them to pump water from wells, to run cream separators, to power their corn shellers and feed grinders, to run small wood saws in the winter. A typical hit-and-miss engine of the era produced somewhere between 1.5 and 6 horsepower. That sounds modest, but running at load for 8 hours, that is a staggering amount of work compared to a single animal and a man. And the thing farmers genuinely loved about them was how simple they were. There was no carburetor in the modern sense. Fuel dripped from a small brass bowl into a simple mixer. Ignition was a battery and a buzz coil, a setup so basic that most farm boys could diagnose and fix it with a screwdriver and a pair of pliers. There were no belts inside the engine to replace, no timing chains to jump. If something broke, you could often see it break. right there in the open air, and fix it with what you had in your pocket. They were also built in, and I mean this literally, like they were designed to outlast civilization. The castings were heavy beyond reason. The tolerances were loose enough that a little dirt and wear didn't matter much. Some of these engines ran continuously for decades with nothing more than a splash of oil every morning. You can still see them run at farm shows across the country. Same engines, same flywheels, turning over after 100 years because whoever built them didn't believe in cutting corners. But here is where I have to stop romanticizing them. Because these machines, as wonderful as they were built in an era when worker safety was essentially a personal problem. Look at this photograph. Count the guards on that equipment. I'll wait. There aren't any. Not one. The flat belt was the primary method of power transmission for stationary engines. You bolted a pulley to your engine's crankshaft, you ran a wide leather belt to a pulley on whatever machine you needed to run, and that was your power transfer. It worked beautifully. It was also completely exposed, completely unguarded, and running at speeds that could snatch a man's arm to the elbow before he even registered the sensation. The accidents were horrifyingly common and horrifyingly predictable. A loose cuff, a dangling strap from a pair of overalls, a glove tucked into a waistband instead of a pocket. Anything that came close to a moving belt or an exposed flywheel had a chance of being seized. And unlike a horse, which might stop when a man cried out, a flywheel that weighed 200 pounds and was spinning at 300 revolutions per minute did not stop. It could not stop. That was the whole point of it. Fingers were the most common loss. Hands less common but not rare. The farm press of the era ran periodic warnings, usually framed as cautionary stories. A farmer in Ohio, a boy in Iowa who was helping his father. The language was always careful and not very specific, but the pattern was consistent. And then there was steam. The stationary gasoline engine was dangerous because of its moving parts. The steam traction engine was dangerous for all of those reasons, plus one additional category: the boiler itself. Steam traction engines were the big iron of their era. A full-size threshing engine might weigh 15 or 20 tons. They moved themselves to the worksite under their own steam, which was remarkable. They burned coal or wood or straw. The boiler was their heart, and it ran at pressures that, if the vessel failed, released energy comparable to a small explosion. Boiler explosions were not rare events. They happened because boilers developed cracks that operators couldn't see. They happened because safety valves rusted shut and pressure built past the rated limit. They happened because the water level dropped too low and superheated iron met cold water in a sequence no engineer had planned for. The role of the steam engineer on a threshing crew was not ceremonial. He was responsible for the fire, for the water level in the glass, for the pressure gauge, for the safety valve. He checked these things constantly, every few minutes during a run, because a distracted engineer was a statistic waiting to happen. In many states, operating a steam traction engine required a licensed engineer. This was not bureaucratic theater. It was a recognition that the man at the throttle was managing something with the destructive potential of a bomb. Add to that the fuel and lubrication situation. Early gasoline was not the stabilized, refined product we fill our cars with today. It was volatile, inconsistent, and often stored in open containers near a hot engine. The combination of raw gasoline, a flywheel ignition system that threw visible sparks, and a farmer who didn't fully appreciate what he was working with, produced fires with alarming regularity. These were powerful machines. They were useful machines. They were genuinely revolutionary. They were also, by any modern standard, instruments of industrial-grade danger in an agricultural setting, operated by men who learned what they knew from a one-page pamphlet and trial and error. So what replaced them? The answer came in two waves. The first was a machine. The small-frame internal combustion tractor and the Fordson, the Farmall, arrived in the 1910s and 1920s with a feature that changed everything: the power takeoff shaft. The PTO meant you didn't need a stationary engine and a belt drive system anymore. You backed your tractor up to your implement, connected the PTO shaft, and the tractor's engine powered both locomotion and machinery. The stationary engine's job, driving implements from a fixed point, became redundant almost overnight. The second wave was the grid itself. The Rural Electrification Act of 1936 accelerated the process that private power companies had considered too unprofitable to pursue, running lines to farms that were spread across the countryside, far from the existing urban grid. By 1935, only about 10% of American farms had electricity. By 1950, that number was close to 90%. Electric motors could do what hit-and-miss engines did. They were quieter, cleaner, safer, and they started with the flip of a switch. You didn't warm them up. You didn't oil the governor weights. You didn't worry about the gasoline can sitting 3 feet away. But here is what I find remarkable about these machines. They didn't all die. Thousands of hit-and-miss engines are still running. Not in museums behind glass. Actually running at shows and on private farms decades or generations after they should have been worn out and scrapped. Because the men who built them, the men at places like Fairbanks Morse, Stover and associated manufacturers, they were building for a world without spare parts stores, without overnight shipping, without the assumption that if something broke, you'd simply buy a new one. They built these engines to be fixed with what was at hand, and as a consequence, they built them to essentially never stop. The iron giants are gone from most farms, but they haven't gone silent. We gained enormously when the grid arrived. Gained safety, convenience, consistency, the ability to power a farm the way you'd power a factory, reliably and at scale. But there is something that went quiet when those engines stopped. Not just the sound, though the sound was something. The rhythm of a hit-and-miss engine is one of those things that gets inside you if you spend an afternoon next to one. Unhurried, mechanical, and organic at the same time. A machine that breathes. What went quiet was the intimacy of it. The farm engineer who knew his engine the way a doctor knows a patient, who could hear a difference in the firing pattern before any gauge registered it, who understood deeply and practically the thing that powered his livelihood. That knowledge doesn't disappear when the machine does. It gets inherited. It ends up at county fair shows and in garages, and in the careful hands of people who think it matters to remember how things worked before they were made easy. I think it matters too. And I think that's why you're here. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of history that doesn't get a lot of airtime, and I appreciate you spending time with it. If you've ever actually seen a hit-and-miss engine run in person, at a show, on a farm in a museum, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, what did it sound like? Did it get under your skin the way it got under mine the first time I stood next to one? And if you found this video useful or interesting, please share it. This channel exists because people who care about agricultural history keep passing this stuff along. Every share genuinely helps. New videos on farm tech origins go up regularly. The next one is going to cover a piece of technology that is arguably just as underappreciated as the hit-and-miss engine, and just as important to how farms actually ran. I'll see you there.